Hello and welcome. My name is Kathleen Coleman Birch, and I am the Communications Manager here at the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. Our director, Susan Gunn, and I are coming to you today from our respective homes in Washington, D.C. Even while working from home during a pandemic, we from the Office for Global Concerns continue to represent the three branches of the Maryknoll mission: the sisters, the fathers and brothers, and the lay missioners, and we work closely with the Maryknoll affiliates. Our job is to bring the Maryknoll mission experience to important debates about public policy at the UN, on Capitol Hill, and to the World Bank, IMF, and corporate world. Our mission is to promote peace, social justice, and integrity of creation. And we do this through education, advocacy, and action. In our work, we write letters to Congress, join meetings with members of Congress, help lead public witness and marches on the streets of Washington, and offer education on global issues. Today, we'll speak with you about US refugee policy in honor of World Refugee Day, which is tomorrow on June 20th. Our director, Susan Gunn, will give us an overview of current refugee policy, the church's response to refugees, and how all of this is related to the upcoming elections. But before we begin, I want to take a minute to recognize that today is Juneteenth, the day on which the news of emancipation from slavery reached the last places in the South after the Civil War, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. It is a day of celebration and festivities, and for some communities, of prayer. I'm going to take a minute to offer a short prayer in honor of this day and the moment our country is in. Loving God, while the legal official slavery of past centuries has been dismantled, our enslavement and abuse of others continues. Open our eyes to systemic racism and the injustices of our time and the ways we contribute to them. Search us, O Lord, and call us to justice. Amen. Thank you. Now I'm going to hand it over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Kathleen. Hello, yes, I'm Susan Gunn, the director of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. And to begin, I have a slideshow. So I want to speak to you while you watch these slides and invite you to write questions in the Q&A or section on the Zoom webinar, or if you're watching on YouTube, on the chat. We'll talk about those after the slideshow. So I'm going to turn off my video and pull up the slides.
Thank you. And on behalf of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns, welcome to Faithful Voting and Global Concerns. This is the second webinar in a series that will be ongoing in preparation for the US elections coming up in the fall. And our hope is to shine a light on some of the international issues facing communities around the world that Maryknoll missioners accompany and also affect all of us here at home. And today, we're looking at one of the most urgent issues that you don't hear about enough in the debates or in the news, and it's welcoming refugees in U.S. policy. For this topic and 7 other topics, we have produced a 2-page brief that is nowhere near exhaustive on the subject, but it's meant to give you the facts, offer some analysis, and point you in the right direction for taking action and voting in November. If you go to our website, www.maryknollogc.org, you'll find right at the top in the middle the link to the series of election briefs. So just click on that. And the election briefs will open up, and before you scroll down to find the 8 topics that we have, each one with a 2-page brief and a 30-minute webinar, you'll see a description of the method that we've used for the series. It's called the See, Judge, Act method. So when you open the 2-page brief, you'll see the 3 parts that we follow. First, the See section, where we study the facts and try to understand what's happening around us. Then the Judge section, where we judge the issues according to our faith and what our faith has to tell us. And then the Act section, which is where we learn how to take action as we're called to respond as Christians, as Catholics, as responsible global citizens. There are some other parts I want to point out. There are facts and data, information about the impact of the coronavirus on refugees, a story from a Maryknoll missioner, and a prayer. I think you'll find all of it a really helpful resource. So let's begin with the C section by seeing a refugee and her situation in the world today. This little girl carrying her sibling is from South Sudan, and she lives in the Palabek refugee settlement camp in Uganda, where Maryknoll fathers John Barth and David Schwinghammer provide pastoral care. Palabek is one of 15 refugee sites in northern Uganda that shelter more than 1 million refugees seeking asylum from war-torn South Sudan, plus some more from the Congo and elsewhere in Africa. There are more than 41,000 people in this camp alone, and most hope to settle there. 60% of them are school-age children. The top priority of the Maryknoll and other missionaries there has been to build and staff schools. Maryknoll supplies uniforms, school uniforms, and some food each day at 4 nursery schools, each holding 200 children. Before we go any further, let's answer, what is a refugee? There is sometimes confusion between the terms migrant, refugee, and asylum seeker. Migrant is an umbrella term for people leaving their homes and often crossing international borders, whether to seek economic opportunity or escape persecution. A refugee, as defined by U.S. law and the 1951 Geneva Convention, is a migrant who is able to demonstrate having been persecuted or having reason to fear persecution on the basis of 5 protected grounds. Under the U.S. system, refugees are those seeking entry from a third country. Asylum seekers are those who meet the criteria for refugee status, but they apply from within the United States or at a port of entry after arriving under different status. Asylum seekers follow a different protocol than those applying for refugee status. Now let's look at the numbers. The UN Refugee Agency released the data for 2019 just yesterday, and you can find it on their website. So we see that war, violence, and persecution have forced a total of 79.5 million people from their homes, and among them, 26 million are refugees, the highest number of refugees in recorded history. 40% of all displaced people are children under the age of 18, and they all urgently need shelter, protection, and safety. The top 5 hosting countries are hosting 73% of refugees in camps coordinated by the UN Refugee Agency, and those countries are Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, and Germany. Besides Germany, wealthier countries aren't doing nearly enough to share the cost of protecting people who have left everything behind. The top 5 countries where refugees came from in 2019, that is 68% came from these 5 countries, and they are Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. We can see what it's like to be a refugee in a camp thanks to letters from Maryknoll's Sister Rosemary Malazzo, who goes by Sister Ro. Here, Sister Ro is on the left hugging a refugee at a camp in Kurdistan, Iraq. Sister Ro wrote on her time there for Maryknoll magazine. "What is it like to be a refugee in a camp?" she wrote. "The children run around while parents try to keep busy with some of the ordinary duties of parenting. I watched young adults sitting, waiting. So many of the young men in the camp have no work and no opportunity for school. They just sit and wait." Knowing all of this, we are honoring refugees right now because of a couple of milestones. Tomorrow, June 20th, is World Refugee Day. It's a day to recognize the strength and resilience and stories of millions of refugees across the globe who have been forced to flee their homes due to violence, conflict, and persecution. Each day on June 20th, the UN Refugee Agency, the 27 countries that accept refugees for resettlement, and countless religious organizations and volunteer agencies around the world host World Refugee Day events in order to draw the public's attention to the millions of refugees worldwide who have been forced to flee their homes due to war. The United States has long accepted refugees fleeing persecution or war, from taking in hundreds of thousands of Europeans displaced by World War II to welcoming those escaping from communist countries in Europe and Asia during the Cold War. The United States has helped define protections for refugees under international humanitarian law. Beginning in 1980, the U.S. government moved from an ad hoc approach to a permanent, standardized system for identifying, vetting, and resettling prospective refugees that is still used today. March 17th marked the 40th anniversary of President Jimmy Carter signing the Refugee Resettlement Act in 1980. And at that time, he said, "Whether the borders that divide us are picket fences or national boundaries, we are all neighbors in a global community." And that is still true today. 40 years ago, Congress passed that landmark legislation with near unanimous bipartisan support, creating a formal process for welcoming refugees based on humanitarian needs and U.S. interests. Since the establishment of the modern-day resettlement program, the annual admissions goal has averaged 95,000 refugees. The United States has long been a global leader in the resettlement of refugees. Until recently, the United States offered refuge each year to more people than all other nations combined, and our country has reaped the benefits of welcoming refugees. Refugees have been good for the economy and good for our society. Refugees pay taxes, and between the years 2005 to 2014, refugees brought in $63 billion more in revenue in taxes than they cost in welfare spending. Refugees are not provided any special treatment when looking for jobs. They must apply and compete for jobs the same as everyone else. Because of their will to survive, they're often willing to take hard-to-fill jobs like meat packing workers. Refugees and immigrants also create jobs for U.S. workers because they have a high propensity for starting new businesses. And refugees have been a major force in contributing to the urban renewal of several major U.S. cities. A top concern from critics of refugee resettlement is that refugees are a drain on the economy and social benefits. Yet countless studies have shown that refugees are not a fiscal burden on the United States. On the contrary, what the U.S. has seen from resettling refugees is economic growth, creation of refugee-owned businesses, diversity in our communities, increased international cooperation because of an understanding that outside of political borders, we are all members of one humanity. Another frequently mentioned concern is that refugees could be a security threat. Prior to World War II, the United States turned away thousands of Jewish refugees due to concerns that they might be criminals or spies, a speculation about refugees that exists today. Yet the research is clear on that too. Refugees are not a security threat. The UN Refugee Agency has a rigorous vetting that can take up to 2 years. It's important to keep repeating that there hasn't been a single deadly terrorist attack in the United States perpetrated by a refugee since the beginning of the resettlement program in 1980. Now, refugees are facing a new crisis, the coronavirus. Many refugee workers are helping fight the coronavirus, both as frontline health workers and as essential workers. Healthcare is one of the most common fields for refugees in the United States, with 15% of all refugees working in the healthcare sector. Besides healthcare, we find that refugees are also essential workers in the U.S. food supply chain. More than 46,000 refugees work in food processing. Like all people in the United States, refugees are doing their share during this very challenging coronavirus pandemic. What makes it even more difficult for refugees is that they may not qualify for stimulus checks or unemployment benefits if they have not earned enough or haven't lived in the United States long enough yet. For example, I heard that from a refugee resettlement agency that the Good Heart brand chicken processing plant laid off its second shift workers a few days ago, and 50 of those workers are refugees. All in all, refugees contribute tremendously to our society by sharing their talents, skills, cultures, and customs in good times and in bad. As I said earlier, until recently, the United States offered refuge each year to more people than all other nations combined. Then 2 major changes happened. When Donald Trump became president in January of 2017, he reversed President Obama's proposal of allowing 110,000 refugees to enter the country that year, and he replaced it with 50,000. President Trump lowered this ceiling further in 2018 to 45,000, and lowered again in 2019 to 30,000, and again in 2020 to 18,000, by far the lowest cap since the creation of the program. And we could see in the first 3 months of the year that the U.S. was not on pace to reach that 18,000 ceiling. As of March 19th, we have only admitted 7,661 refugees. Then the coronavirus hit, and the resettlement program came to a complete halt. Well, there have been a couple of special cases, emergency cases from Afghanistan. But the shutdown followed an international halt that the UN Refugee Agency implemented, plus halts to travel and lockdown in host countries disrupted the whole system. The impact of the coronavirus will be deep and long-lasting. Refugees stuck in camps use 3 simple words to describe life: hunger, lice, and filth. Living in tents, refugees are extremely vulnerable to coronavirus outbreaks, given the crowded conditions and lack of sanitation. People feel more desperate without jobs and income. All vulnerabilities are heightened. Everyone's life is harder. Experts say that refugee hosting countries that have had the virus are now 3 to 4 months away from peaking. So we're concerned about refugees in Bangladesh, Greece, Kenya, and Lebanon. The UN refugee agency is trying to stem the tide of the virus. They launched an appeal for hygiene supplies and training. And here in Washington, we and other international organizations are requesting $12 billion from Congress for international assistance in the next supplemental spending package. This is a long-term issue for refugee populations, and it needs long-term investment. To recap, what do we see? We see the highest number of refugees ever recorded in the world, 26 million, and we see the lowest number of refugees admitted to the United States, 7,661. But we also know we have a history of bipartisan support for refugees in Congress, and we see this pandemic and it's requiring more essential frontline workers. We also know that economic recession is going to require new businesses and new ideas. And we look to refugees and we see a people willing to start over in a new country with nothing but their courage. That brings us to the second section in our method, the judge section, where we ask the question, how does our faith inform our thinking about this issue? We look to the Bible and to the church teaching to guide us. When we look to Scripture to answer the question, how does our faith inform our thinking about this issue? We read Matthew chapter 22. Where Jesus says, nothing is more important than love. The greatest commandment is to love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the second is like this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And when it comes to how we respond to a migrant or refugee in need of help, Jesus is clear, offer love. And in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus said, we will find him in the least of these, the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, the imprisoned. Jesus said, amen, I say to you, whatever you did for the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did for me. So it is our care for the stranger where we encounter God. We also look to church teachings to help us answer how does our faith inform our thinking about this issue. There are many church documents, too many to go through today, so I'm going to focus on one, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, which, when it was released in 1965, laid out a vision for the future of the church. At that time, in 1965, the church was in a world exhausted by war, by violence, a world wanting the church's leadership for peace. The first words of the document are, the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or any way afflicted, these are the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the followers of Christ. So that is how we center our hearts and minds. Pope Francis has been very outspoken about our call as Christians to welcome the stranger and protect the vulnerable. In this photo, he washes and kisses the feet of refugees at a refugee center near Rome on Holy Thursday in 2016. It's a powerful gesture. As a new pope in 2013, Francis made his first trip outside of Rome to the tiny Italian island of Lampedusa, where some migrants had died trying to reach shore in overcrowded boats coming from the African continent, and where many hundreds more lived in makeshift tents already. He met with the migrants to mourn and to pray with them, and at an outdoor mass, the Pope called for a reawakening of consciousness to counter the indifference shown to migrants. He said, we've lost a sense of brotherly responsibility, and we have forgotten how to cry for migrants lost at sea. Since then, he has met with migrants and refugees on the Greek island of Lesbos, another major transit point from Africa to Europe, to hear about their struggles, pray with them, and call attention to their needs. On a plane back from Lesbos, he brought some Syrian refugee families to live in the Vatican. And more recently, Pope Francis visited Morocco, where he met with refugees and migrants at a Catholic relief center and said, you are at the center of the Church's heart. To recap, how does our faith inform our thinking about this issue? Our faith teaches us to offer love, to welcome the stranger, to take on the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of refugees, and to remember refugees are at the center of the Church's heart. That brings us to the third and final section of our method, ACT, to take action. The action for World Refugee Day this year is more urgent than ever because of the growing spread of the coronavirus and the increasing unwillingness of countries like the United States to host refugees. So let's see what we can do. We have an action alert on our website where you can send a letter to Congress and urge them to revitalize U.S. support for refugees in 3 ways. to co-sponsor either in the House or the Senate a resolution to express strong bipartisan support for refugees. It's important to get strong bipartisan support now before the president begins to formulate his number for the refugee cap for next year. That will happen in the fall. So we're working on this now. Also, the next ask for Congress includes $642 million in supplemental funding for the Office for Refugee Resettlement COVID-19 response, and the third ask to support safe resumption and return to traditional resettlement admission levels of 95,000 refugees annually. We do not want 18,000, we want 95,000 refugees annually. So there's just one web address you need to remember, www.maryknollogc.org. Go there, click on the election briefs, and you'll find a link to resources where you'll have the link to send a letter to Congress and some other resources as well that I want to tell you about. One of the resources is a free screening of a new film online tonight. It's a film called Refugee. It tells the story of a Syrian doctor who attempts to escape her war-ravaged homeland with her young daughter. You can find the link to this and all other things on our website. Let me tell you about some more things. You'll also find links to resources from the Vatican, from Pope Francis, from the U.S. Bishops' Conference. You're also invited to a live stream conversation with Maryknoll lay missioner Dee Dungy from Kenya on Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time on the Maryknoll lay missioner Facebook page and YouTube channel. Just go to our website and click on the link for the election briefs and you'll find all the information there. Finally, for the election, we ask you to seek policy commitments from candidates, talk to them, ask them to demonstrate strong support for refugees in your community, and commit to funding the Office for Refugee Resettlement and support their return to 95,000 refugees annually. And as we get closer to Election Day, I invite you to pause, take a deep breath, and say a prayer. God of our wandering ancestors, may they find a friend in me. God bless all refugees. And then get ready to go to the polls and vote. Check out your candidates. Where do they stand? If they don't say, ask them. Express your opinion and get them on the record. And then after thoughtful consideration, do your very best to vote for welcoming refugees. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for all this excellent information. And it looks like we have just a few minutes for some questions, which I think have been appearing. All right, so the first one, can you say more about how you use the term refugee? What about internally displaced people or climate refugees?
Sure, that's a great question. And I want to begin by saying we're not making a moral distinction about who's who. We're just using the legal recognized term because we're talking about U.S. policy and engaging with the coordination of refugee resettlement. So that's why we adopt the terms. But there is a distinction between refugees and internally displaced persons. It's shorter to just say IDPs, internally displaced persons. And as you can hear from the name, a refugee is someone who flees their home and crosses an international border for safety. An internally displaced person flees their home and does not cross a border. So they are trying to find safety within their own country. And I said that there are 26 million refugees. Well, there are many, many more internally displaced people. The UN says 45.7 million IDPs. So to help IDPs, the UN coordinates and works with partner humanitarian organizations, many of the same ones that they work with to help refugees. It's just sort of a separate avenue for channeling money and efforts and organizing how to help these people. I want you to know that we're well aware of the needs of the 45 million IDPs, and Pope Francis has chosen to focus on IDPs in his message for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, and that is celebrated in the Catholic Church on September 27th. He's already released the message, and I included the link to it in the resource section on our website. One other little thing, climate refugees, that you've probably heard of. This is a new idea, and there's no formal international definition or recognition, but we're all seeing it, right? We see a surge in the number of people displaced in the Southeast from hurricanes and flooding, in the West Coast of the United States from fires. So it's something that we're all absolutely aware of, but our policies and our systems are not up to it yet. They're not on top of it. We saw some progress in the UN with the Global Compact of Migration, recognizing it in some way, but climate refugees as a defined group receiving services, we're not quite there yet.
Thanks, Susan. That's helpful. Another question for you. What are the consequences of the US shrinking its refugee program in these last few years? And how can we help locally?
Oh, yes. It is not an exaggeration to say that the United States system for resettling refugees is collapsing. All of the 9 organizations that work with the government to resettle refugees in the US have had to lay off staff and close offices. And that includes the US Catholic Bishops Conference, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, the Jewish group HIAS, which stands for Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. It's a huge loss. It's a brain drain. We're losing skilled and experienced employees, loss of relationships with local churches and businesses that help refugees in some way. It leaves the whole future of the system in balance. So we really need to get the number back up again and get the system flowing, or we won't be in any position to respond well to any refugees.
Wow, okay, thank you. Important for us all to keep in mind. And finally, I think we have time for one more. Why does the US take on so much of the burden of hosting refugees? Why don't other wealthy countries host more?
Right. Well, the United States has had the largest resettlement program in the world because refugee resettlement has been a natural fit for our diverse society and our economy. Immigration has always been a part of the American story, and also defending and promoting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And let's remember who refugees who qualify for resettlement are. They are the most vulnerable of all refugees. You see, most refugees eventually go home again when it's safe. Some stay in the temporary settlements, like the little girl in Uganda I shared about, and a tiny fraction resettle to a third country, such as the United States. And they resettle in the third country because going home or staying in the settlement is not a safe option. So resettling refugees is a life issue. It is defending life. And that's one of the reasons it's traditionally been received bipartisan support. And the US government has historically recognized, and rightly so, that resettlement is not only about saving lives, it's an important way for our country to support other countries that are hosting the majority of world refugees. It's good strategic foreign policy. It's good economic policy, and it's good social policy. And the refugees that the US chooses to resettle have to fit into 4 categories: women and girls at risk, children at risk, survivors of violence to torture or violence itself, and those with medical needs. And then they vet these people for almost 2-year process. So the UN recognizes them, does a little vetting, gives those names to the US, and the US does extensive background checks and interviews. And these folks don't know until the day before they get on the plane if they've passed the final interview to come to the United States. They are the most vetted and safest people on the planet, I would say. So if you can think of your neighbors who are refugees, I know I have many neighbors who are Vietnamese and African refugees. And if I had to describe them in general, I would say they are overachievers. They are all working, they're entrepreneurs, business owners, their kids go to college and grad school, they pool their money to buy a house. They're absolute overachievers, they're great neighbors and excellent citizens. So the concerns about security risk, the travel ban that was put in place, the slashing of the arrivals number. We need to turn these policies around, set them right, help refugees in our communities right now, and prepare to welcome more.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for today. I want to say thank you again to Susan for all this wonderful information and insight, and to everyone who joined us today. And I hope this webinar and the two-pager on refugee policy, which is available on our website, can empower all of us to contribute to important conversations in this election year and to wake people up to the need to revitalize the US response to refugees. Our next webinar will be on climate change in US policy on Tuesday, July 7th from 12:30 to 1 p.m. You can find registration info on our website. We hope to see you then. Thanks so much.
Thank you.